Thank you. Although this is a talk, I've kept the structure of a guided walk, which I've conducted with different groups, looking at Edinburgh's Venetian architecture. We'll start at the university, then walk across the old town to the first new town. I hope this will help locate the buildings in your mind. As part of the talk, I've subcontracted performing 2 relevant poems to my wife, Irene. Thank you also to Rosemary Mann and Eric Drake for their help in producing and managing the slideshow. So, Edinburgh, the Venice of the North, ? Wikipedia lists Stockholm and no less than 39 other Northern European cities claiming to be the Venice of the North, including Glasgow's Mary Hill. But Edinburgh is not one of them. The architectural historian, Professor Deborah Howard, has written about the connections between Venice and Scotland, and I acknowledge that work as a main source for this talk. But even she says Venetian architecture had far less influence on Scotland than the architecture of, say, France, Netherlands, England, or even Greece. So you might be expecting a very short talk. Venetian influence on Scottish architecture increased in the later 19th century, which is the time period where we start and finish this walk at 2 public buildings. Here at the university's graduation hall at the start and the portrait gallery at the end, both designed by Sir Robert Rowan Anderson. If we were in the late 19th century and I was to ask you who was the most important Scottish architect of the age, you wouldn't be saying Charles Rennie Mackintosh or Alexander Greig Thomson. The chances are you'd say Robert Anderson. In Edinburgh alone, he designed the McEwan Hall, Medical School, National Portrait Gallery, 3 churches and a number of villas. He designed Mount Stewart on Bute for Britain's wealthiest individual, the Marquis of Bute. He restored Dunblane Cathedral and Paisley Abbey. He helped found the Edinburgh College of Art and the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland. He left them his own house in Rutland Square to be its headquarters to this day. He was knighted for his work at Balmoral and was awarded the Royal Gold Medal. He was Scotland's premier architect. Nevertheless, to use the word that Muriel Sparks saw as the core of the Edinburgh thought pattern, nevertheless, as the years went on, Robert Rowan Anderson developed a reputation for being difficult to deal with. He's been described as having an awesome firmness on what he considered to be matters of principle. And he also gained a reputation for exceeding budgets. One of his clients called him Robert Rowan Anderson. Here we're looking at the McEwan Hall, designed by him in 1888 and memorably described in the Buildings of Scotland as a magnificent petrified blancmange. The finely carved details of McEwan Hall are drawn from Venetian early Renaissance. Similar details can also be seen on the Venetian-style memorial lantern to McEwan himself, also by Anderson. The Renaissance came late to Venice from Florence. Venice was self-confident in its own traditions. And even when it did, Venice stuck to its own rather finely detailed decorative tradition, transformed from Gothic to classical garb, as seen here in the gateway to the Scuola di San Giovanni Evangelista. The Scuoli were religious and social care confraternities of non-aristocratic lay people. They were in artistic competition with each other. Here is another one, also dating from the early Venetian Renaissance, the beautiful Scuola di San Marco, which we will hear about later. Suffice to say here that it is not located in St. Mark's Square. The doorway to the McEwan Hall, for example, is clearly derived from that at the Scuola di San Marco. The magnificent interior of the McEwen Hall appears to be influenced by the drawing on the left of a circular temple, taken from a famous 15th century Venetian book. As you can see, the interior is well worth visiting if you ever get the chance. Nevertheless, am I stretching this Venice connection beyond credibility? What did Anderson know of the Scuole of Venice, or 15th century Venetian architecture books? Well, Anderson was fluent in a number of European languages. He went on study tours twice to France and Italy for a total of 14 months. And in 1868, he published a book, Examples of Municipal, Commercial and Street Architecture of France and Italy from the 12th to 15th century. He was an expert. If we now wander round the corner into Teviot Place, we see the frontage of the old medical school, also by Anderson. He won the competition for this job in 1874, following a whistle-stop tour of modern medical schools in Germany, Holland, France, and England. This part of the medical school is also based on Venetian sources. And I want you to note in particular the large, heavy arch at roof level over the entrance and the form of the upper floor windows. The arch at roof level is a motif running through Venetian architecture, starting with the frontage of the Basilica of St. Mark's, and we've just seen examples on the roof line of the Scuola di San Marco. It was further developed by the Venetian architect Mauro Cadusi, as he moved the early Venetian Renaissance to something stronger, more symmetrical, and less purely decorative. So on the left is an example of his work, the frontage of San Michele, Venice's cemetery chapel. And on the right, he finished the prestigious church of San Zaccaria, where he designed the upper levels. The windows of the medical school are based on a type developed by Cadusi and often called a Cadusi window. As seen here on the left on the Palazzo Vendramin, which is now Venice's casino, and it's the palace in which Wagner died. When I first did this walk, someone asked, why Venice? What attracted Victorian architects? I suggest there was an ideological reason, perhaps. Venice is a country with a small land mass, but a great maritime trading empire, which was politically stable, never invaded for close on 1,000 years. It was ruled by what in effect was the equivalent to a constitutional monarchy, and it was even rather semi-detached from the Church of Rome. You can see the attraction to Victorian Britain. But there were practical reasons too for architects. If we look at the Palace Vendramin, the merchant character of Venice, the density of its buildings, political stability meant that its palaces, which in fact doubled as commercial premises, were tall with an open street frontage, even if the street was the canal, and with no fear of invasions or coups or riots, plus a local glass-making industry. They had large windows, as we see here. Contrast this with the typical Florentine palazzo on the right, for example, the Palazzo Strozzi. The Venetian palace is a much more suitable source for the requirements of most Victorian public or commercial buildings. Behind the medical school frontage we've just seen on Teviot Place, there is a courtyard that anyone can walk into. I'm always surprised how many Edinburgh folk have never seen this stunning space. I do think it's lovely, though, that the university staff are so kind to their cars that they set aside this beautiful courtyard, which would cost tens of millions of pounds to build nowadays, for use as a car park. The current complex of medical school and graduation hall is impressive enough, but the original design, as shown here, also proposed an enormous campanile at the junction of the two buildings. This was intended to indicate the location of the university in any views over the city. It was never built. Anderson based the details of this tower closely on the campanile in St. Mark's Square, Here is the one he would have seen as it was collapsing in 1902. So if you've ever wondered what that bulky windowless projection is at the far end of this view, sticking inconveniently out into the pavement, it is the base of the unbuilt tower. So the practical imperialist Britain may have looked towards Venice as an example of a great maritime mercantile empire. Nevertheless, many 19th century visitors, particularly the Romantic poets and artists, saw something different. Venice was in terminal decline, and its ruin was a terrible warning to Britain. This could happen to us. Here is a famous Bridge of Sighs linking the Doge's palace and its prison, and given this name by the Romantic poets. From here, that half-Scottish poet, Lord Byron, considered the decline of Venice in Canto 4 of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage of 1818.
I stood in Venice on the Bridge of Sighs, a palace and a prison on each hand. I saw from out the wave her structures rise as from the stroke of the enchanter's wand. 1,000 years their cloudy wings expand around me, and a dying glory smiles o'er the far times, when many a subject land looked to the winged lion's marble pile, where Venice sat in state, throned on her 100 isles. In Venice, Tasso's echoes are no more, and silent rose the songless gondolier. Her palaces are crumbling to the shore, and music meets not always now the ear. Those days are gone, but beauty still is here. States fall, arts fade, but nature does not die, nor yet forget how Venice once was dear, the pleasant place of all festivity, the revel of the earth, the mask of Italy. I loved her from my boyhood. She, to me, was as fair a city of the heart, rising like water columns from the sea, of joy the sojourn, and of wealth the mart. And Otway, Radcliffe, Schiller, Shakespeare's art had stamped her image in me, and even so, although I found her thus, we did not part. Perchance, even dearer in her day of woe, than when she was a boast, a marvel, and a show.
Thank you, Irene. It became a commonplace for any bridge built between two buildings to be called the Bridge of Sighs. Here, for example, at Cambridge and in Oxford. Even Glasgow claims that the name for its bridge leading to the necropolis. So perhaps we should claim this bridge as Edinburgh's Bridge of Sighs. It is at least Italianate in style and linked to public buildings. This bridge is here because the university, keen to free up teaching space, donated much of its collection to the new museum on Chambers Street, on condition that a linking bridge was built so that students still had access to the collections. This arrangement is no more, because the museum once made the mistake of storing wine for a forthcoming reception on the bridge. Secure, they thought, with a locked door at each end. When the time for the reception came, no wine. As you will have already guessed, the students had managed to access the bridge from the university end, a bridge of size for the reception organisers. We now walk down under that bridge and onto Chamber Street to view the Royal Scottish Museum, designed in 1861. The projecting end pavilions are clearly based on Venetian palaces. For example, the Palazzo Corner, which shows, as with the museum, that traditional tripartite facade, which was a structural necessity on Venice's mud. The long, repetitive central section of the museum is derived from the repetitive frontage of the buildings which Venice built for its public officials. These provided a useful source for large-scale Venetian buildings. Here, for example, is the Procurati Vecchio in St. Mark's Square. We now leave Chamber Street and walk to the heart of the Old Town, to Parliament Square. This slide shows how lively Parliament Close once was. But where did the idea for this square, formed in the 17th century, come from? There are no similar squares in Scotland. Miles Glendinning, in his 2004 book, The Architecture of Scottish Government, says, there were 4 possible models for the Parliament Close Improvement Project: the Roman Forum, the Capitoline Hill in Rome, St. Mark's Square in Venice, which was a forum more accessible to Scots than Rome during the Inquisition, and finally the Place Royale in France. Elements from Venice's St. Mark's Square include the arcades and the juxtaposition of governmental and legislative buildings with commercial and religious structures. Is Miles Glendinning stretching things? Well, there was knowledge of Venice in Scotland in the 16th and 17th century. 51 Scots were registered at the University of Padua between 1617 and 1645. Padua is only 20 miles from Venice. And we know that Venetians visited Scotland, including in the mid-16th century, Daniele Barbaro, the Venetian ambassador to England and a patron of Andrea Palladio, Venice's most famous architect. And in 1599, the monarch, King Jamie VI, wrote an epic poem about one of the high points of Venetian history, the defeat of the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. Here is an extract from Jamie VI's poem.
I sing a wondrous work o' God. I sing his mercies great. I sing his justice here withal, poured for his holy state. To wit, a cruel martial war, a bloody battle bald, lang dootsome fecht with slaughter huge and wounded manifold, which focht was in Lepanto's gulf, betwixt the baptized race and circumcised turbaned Turks recontrin in that place. Gae quickly then to Venice town and pit into their minds to tak revenge or wrangs the Turks he din in sundry lands.
Thank you, Irene. So knowledge of Venice went high up in Scottish society. In the centre of Parliament Square is the only extant equestrian statue of King Charles II. The statue was provided by the architect James Smith, who probably sourced it in Holland. The most famous equestrian statues since classical times, which could have been a source, were both in Venetian lands. The oldest is by Donatello in Padua. And then in Venice itself, a statue to the mercenary Colleoni by Verrocchio. It stands in front of the Scuola di San Marco, which is in the background on the left, and which we've seen before. Corleone, the subject of the statue, left a vast sum in his will to the Venetian state, provided it erected a statue to him in front of St. Mark's. Now, this was a problem for the Venetian state, which never liked to see individuals getting above themselves. There were no statues to individuals in the city, and certainly none in front of Basilica di San Marco. They got round the problem by putting the statue in front of the Scuola di San Marco instead, in a much more obscure part of the city, and claimed the money. There is probably Venetian influence elsewhere in the Old Town. St. Cecilia's Hall in the Cowgate is the second oldest building designed for musical performances in these islands. It was designed by Robert Milne, and he studied architecture and drawing in Rome under the famous Piranesi, and he visited Venice in 1759 on his way home. St. Cecilia's was designed just 4 years later in 1763, and as you can see, it's oval. What is usually considered the very first concert hall in Europe, the Holywell Music Room in Oxford, was designed in 1748 and is not oval. However, in Venice, 3 years before, in 1745, this church on the right was built. But it was in fact built primarily to be a concert hall. Its purpose was to raise money from public concerts for the adjacent orphanage. Vivaldi had been music director for the orphanage and the previous church on the site. And this concert hall cum church, in existence when Milne visited Venice, is oval. The Canongate Kirk of 1688, with its curly gable, is often considered to show Dutch influence on Scottish architecture, reflecting our close connection with the Netherlands. But Professor Deborah Howard, who wrote the standard book in English on Venetian architecture, points out that there are no churches in the Netherlands that look like this. The Canongate Kirk reminds her much more of the smaller type of Venetian parish church, with their tripartite frontages and curved gables, particularly if you take account of the fact that the Canongate has a cruciform plan and an apse, and that apse has a caducee window. All of this hardly designed for Presbyterian worship. The examples shown are top right, Santa Maria de Carmini, and bottom left, San Giovanni in Bregora, two small churches in Venice. Can there possibly be a connection? Well, the architect of the Canongate Kirk was James Smith, the man who supplied that equestrian statue of Charles II. He was a Catholic from Rothshire and already a stonemason. At the age of 26, he went to the Scots College in Rome to train as a priest. He hated it, left, but stayed on in Rome, perhaps supporting himself as a mason while studying Italian architecture. When he returned to Scotland, he was one of only 2 architects in Britain with direct experience of Italian architecture. The entrance to the naval dockyard in Venice, the Arsenale, the place which gave us the word arsenal, was completed as a monument to the victory at Lepanto that we've already heard about. According to Professor Howard, this style of gateway with its double columns and an overmantel rapidly became an image of triumphal rule throughout Europe. The old entrance to Parliament Hall was a simplified version, but there are 2 more obvious versions in the Old Town. Here at the entrance to George Heriot's from 1630s, and on the right, Holyrood House, where the entrance dates from around 1678. The architect at Holyrood was William Bruce. Not only did he own Palladio's treatise on architecture, but his work shows a direct knowledge of Italian buildings that couldn't have come from books. Probably came from James Smith, who we know was in contact with him and later worked with him. So plenty of Venetian sources in the Old Town, even if you think Parliament Square as it is now is not quite Edinburgh's Piazza di San Marco. Surely it deserves more than just being a car park. And whatever you think of John Knox, he was an important figure in Scottish history. Surely he deserves more than having his final resting place as car park space 23. We now leave the old town and wander down to the new town. At the West End, our old friend Robert Rowland Anderson decided that his unused design for the campanile at the university was too good to go to waste, and he added this tower to St George's Free Church in Shandwick Place. He did slightly alter his design so that the Tower of St George's more closely resembles the campanile of San Giorgio Maggiore on the right, the church designed by Palladio, which sits on an island across from St Mark's Square. It's interesting to compare these two photographs. The designs may be similar, but location, materials, and light make one quintessentially Venetian and the other very Edinburgh. The greatest Venetian building of the new town is no more. Here it is, the Life Association of building on Princess Street, designed by David Rind in 1855 and demolished in 1967. Its demolition helped to kickstart the building conservation movement in Edinburgh. The realization, as Rosemary Mann has said, that planning was too important to be left to the planners. You can see how closely based the LAS building was on the Carrot Zonico of 1667 on the Grand Canal, just with some extra mezzanine floor squeezed in. A friend who worked in the LAS building said it was a warren of small rooms. Between the earlier Venetian town planning and buildings we've seen in the Old Town, say up to around 1760, and the Victorian rediscovery of Venetian architecture from the 1850s, any Venetian influence in Edinburgh is limited to that from the villas of Palladio and the Veneto, the Venetian countryside. The City Observatory of 1818 by William Playfair here, you may think, is an obvious Athens of the North building. But with its central planning, 4 porticos, dome, and hilltop location, it's an obvious reworking, though in a severe neoclassical style, of Palladio's most famous villa, the Villa Rotunda. The Villa Rotunda had already influenced the design of a number of British country houses, including Chiswick House in West London, for the main promoter of Palladianism in Britain, Lord Burlington. In 1851, the most famous Victorian art critic, John Ruskin, started to publish The Stones of Venice, which championed Gothic, and particularly Venetian Gothic, over classical architecture. He had a right scunner at Palladio and the Palladianism of the likes of Chiswick House. A building influenced by this change of taste led by Ruskin sits just off the east end of Princess Street near the Café Royal, but is little known. This ornate building was, believe it or not, designed as a stationery warehouse. The client was Cowan's, the Pennycook papermaker, who also had a factory in the Dummy Dykes. But built in 1864, it was one of the first commissions for architect William Hamilton Beattie, who later in his career designed both Jenner's and the North British Hotel. The Buildings of Scotland describes Cowan's as Venetian Gothic and Ruskinian spirit, and with real feeling for the style. Cowan's warehouse is one of Edinburgh's most obviously Venetian buildings. The details are drawn from the Gothic palaces of Venice, such as the palazzos shown on the left, in particular the distinctive OG-shaped arches derived from Islamic architecture, reflecting Venice's close contact with Constantinople and the Eastern Mediterranean. And here is Cowan's warehouse recognised as being Venetian by the Edinburgh historian Andy Arthur. As we now walk northwards towards the end of our walk, we pass the head office of the Royal Bank on St Andrew's Square, the grandest house of the first new town. It's designed in 1771 by Sir William Chambers, the great rival of Robert Adam. It is based on Palladio's villas, and like the City Observatory, it dates from that period when the only Venetian influence in Edinburgh was through Palladio's works. The direct source for the house is probably the simpler and chaste marble hill house, which sits beside the Thames in Twickenham. But that itself was derived from Palladio's numerous villas, such as the Villa Foscari. We finish our walk on Queen Street and York Place. John Ruskin gave a famous series of lectures in rooms in Queen Street in 1853, just after his Stones of Venice was published. The first lecture was on why Gothic architecture was superior to classical. And in it, he berated the good Edinburghers for their attachment to classical order in the new town. Ruskin was a bit of an obsessive, and on his walk along Queen Street to give the talk, he counted 678 windows, all similar to the ones we see here. He described them as all absolutely similar and without decoration. He said, if you say to me, well, we see sunsets over and over again, but never tire of them, I say to you, did you ever see one sunset like another? So it's probably not a coincidence that the design of the National Portrait Gallery in Queen Street in 1885 is, as Professor Duncan Macmillan has written, a tribute to Ruskin's influence. The design, once again by our friend Robert Rowan Anderson, draws on a number of French and Italian sources, but the overall form comes from the Doge's Palace. Ruskin considered the Doge's Palace to be the central building of the world, melding Northern European Gothic, Mediterranean classical, and Eastern Islamic architectures. One of the advantages of the Doge's Palace as a source for Anderson was the large blank upper floor, which allowed for top-lit galleries and with lots of wall space. However, the Gothic arches on the ground floor reduced the space available for display there. There is a story that the first keeper complained about this, but Anderson said that that was the shape of Gothic architecture and he could do nothing about it. Nevertheless, the keeper replied, it would have been better if you designed them upside down. So there is the end of our tour. What conclusion can we draw? Well, we've seen that there has indeed been a Venetian influence on Edinburgh's architecture and over hundreds of years. Perhaps we can drop the question mark of the talk's title. But Venice is only one of many sources that Edinburgh architects have drawn on. Central Edinburgh is more varied than just a medieval old town and a classical new town, whatever is said in UNESCO's description of the World Heritage Site. This view of the old town, for example, shows no medieval buildings. And this view of the new town contains very few classical Georgian buildings. Perhaps we've overplayed the Athens of the North, and we've underplayed the importance of our varied Victorian architecture on our cityscape. We've not recognised that the character of Edinburgh is perhaps the very variety of its architectural sources. Robert Louis Stevenson got it right in his picturesque notes. On all sides, what a clashing of architecture. There may be seen buildings in almost every style upon the globe. Egyptian and Greek temples, Venetian palaces, and Gothic spires are huddled over one another in a most admired disorder. I leave you with this map entitled Auld Lichie, prepared by Neil Smith Design, which shows Edinburgh in the year 2164, when it has become the Venice of the North. And Eric has put on to that map the buildings which we've seen on our tour. Thank you very much.